السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا بفيض فضلك رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on the Multaqa al-Abhur of Imam Ibrahim al-Halabi rahimahullah ta'ala, we have reached a very important lesson, and that is the lesson on riba, on what used to be commonly referred to as usury. And riba is one of the most critical of issues because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not forbidden anything as intensely as He has forbidden riba. And we'll be sharing a supplementary resource on the prohibition of riba that is worth going through, and we are bi'idhnillahi ta'ala giving you a supplementary lesson on this important topic that you will find to be of benefit bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. Now this section also shows us something very practical regarding the rulings of the Sharia, that the ulama do not see as their duty to tell you about obvious matters of the akhirah. Does the author tell us anything about riba being a major sin? Sadati?
No.
Right? Why? Why wouldn't he tell us something that important?
It's no.
Yeah, because fiqh is not directly related to talking about matters of the akhirah. Those are known. Right? There's assumptions made by the fuqaha that you are a believer. You, being a believer, you have a connection with the Quran. Being a student of knowledge, you should know something about the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So these are things that are presupposed. And we will tackle the critical nature of riba in the supplementary lesson, but it's important. But willfully engaging in riba is from the kaba'ir, is from the major sins. And both consuming riba and giving riba are of the major sins. And if you look at the verses on riba, and we'll be covering these in the supplementary lesson, there is nothing that has been prohibited as intensely in the primary texts in the Quran, in the Sunnah, as has riba been prohibited in the Quran and the Sunnah. Right? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala declares war upon those who engage in riba. الَّذِينَ يَأْكُلُونَ الرِّبَى, those who consume riba, yani stand only as one stands who has been driven crazy by the touch of the devil. Right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that, and if they do not desist, then declare, then there is an open declaration of war from Allah and His Messenger. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has only declared war upon two categories of believers. One is those who engage in riba, that's in the Quran. The other is those who show enmity to the elect servants of Allah. Right? In the hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari and elsewhere, Man adha it's a hadith Qudsi, the Prophet ﷺ says, Allah Most High says, Man adha li liyan faqad adhantuhu bil harb. Whoever shows enmity to an elect servant of mine, I declare war upon. I declare war upon. So this is very, very significant. Right? This is very, very significant. And we'll be looking at that and the key related issues. So these notions, right, that, well, we're still living in Dar al-Harb, right, etc. We'll be touching upon that at the end. These are what some of the Mashaykh refer to as flea-bitten fatwas. They're unfortunate occurrences because the rulings of Dar al-Harb do not apply to our circumstances. And we'll come to that in a minute. But especially if you consider how grave the prohibition of riba is, then you would approach anything related to riba with the utmost of caution. And that is the governing principle that the fuqaha mention regarding this. But in this chapter, we'll be focused on the rulings of riba. And this also highlights this important principle that the ruling of something is either worldly or next worldly. And it's either outward or inward. And the fuqaha look at the outward worldly ruling. Its spiritual consequences in this life, its consequences in the hereafter, those are known, so they will not delve into it. And that is sort of the nature of, it's like if you go to a medical doctor and you need surgery, they'll deal with you that, okay, you need to do this, this, this. At that time, they don't have to tell you about your diet, this and that, because those are things that are outside the purview of dealing with their immediate concern. And we've touched upon that earlier. So let's look at what the author has to tell us, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi. Right? And in this, we will look at a number of issues related to understanding the nature of Hanafi fiqh and some of the rulings, but also understanding some critical matters, including very significantly that there are rulings and there are presuppositions those rulings are built upon. If you take those presuppositions out, then you are misportraying the rulings themselves. So today we're going to look at what riba is and its definition. We're going to also look at the illah, the legal cause of the prohibition of riba, and how it relates to the two things that come together to form the illah, the legal cause for the prohibition of riba. These being the extent, and number two, the category of the item, al-qadr wal-jins. And so let's look at the core rulings of riba بإذن الله تعالى. قال الإمام إبراهيم al-Halabi رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا به وبكم. باب الربا, the chapter on riba. So riba in the Arabic language, as the commentators tell us, refers to ziyada. Right? Riba refers to an extra, but it presupposes that there's something happening, and that increase in the thing that happening, that is riba. So yarbu or yurbi yarbu is for something to be growing and to have an increase. So it is either a ziyada or fadl, right? It's an increase or that which is above the baseline. Right? So riba is an increase. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses this very term when He says that وَيُرْبِ الصَّدَقَاتِ, right? That يَمْحَقُ اللَّهُ الرِّبَى, Allah wipes out riba, وَيُرْبِ الصَّدَقَاتِ. He uses the same root, وَيُرْبِ, and He gives increase to sadaqat, to charity. Right? So it is this increase. But in it, there's this core sense that there's a baseline, and as we'll look at the definition, there's a baseline. And what is the baseline? That is what is rightfully agreed upon. And then there's a stipulated increase, and this has no recognized consideration connected with it. Recognized consideration meaning that the Sharia recognizes this kind of increase. And that specified increase, that is riba. So, and from that you see the connection between the linguistic meaning that there's a baseline, and that which is above that baseline is riba. And that's what distinguishes riba from profit. From profit. Why? Because in a transaction, what is permitted, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ahallallahu al-bay'a. Allah has permitted trade. Bay'a here refers to trading, right? And trading is on the basis of profit sharing. So that has been permitted. Ahallallahu al-bay'a wa harrama al-riba, right? And He's prohibited riba. And the beginning of that verse, what does it say? That they say, meaning the disbelievers, that innamal bay'u mithlu riba, that trade is like riba. How is trade like riba? How is trade like riba? So if you wanted to finance your startup, Sidi Abdul Latif, you wanted to finance your startup, you could either take $100,000 loan on interest. So you took $100,000, put it in your business, and you're giving 10% on the loan to the financing party. Right? So you took a baseline and you're paying $10,000. 10%. If you got the financing party to be an investor, they gave you 100,000 as an investment. You make money, you give them a certain percentage of what you earned. Correct? In both cases, they gave you some money, $100,000, and you agreed to give them some money. So what is the difference between, and that's the argument made by the disbelievers, and likewise by people who lack the knowledge of faith, or they lack submission to the command of Allah, even if they don't understand. What's the resemblance between the two? Let's begin with that. What's the resemblance between a trade arrangement, i.e. where the person providing the money invests in you? What are the shared meanings? And then we'll see what's the difference.
There's a benefit to both parties.
There's a benefit to both parties. But like, let's just say for the person who needed the money, in both cases, what is shared? That you are taking a certain amount of money and you are giving a certain amount of money above and beyond what you took. Correct? So that's the point of similitude. Right? In both cases, whether the person is financing or giving a loan, in both cases, they gave you $100,000. In the case of it being stipulated interest, you are paying X% on the money you borrowed. Correct? Let's say 10%. In the other case, they provided $100,000 of financing. So they come in as an investor. If everything goes well, will you be paying them more than that 100,000? Will you be paying them more than that 100,000?
No.
If everything goes well, if they are an investor. So they
Yes,
invested $100,000 and they have 50% ownership of your Sibha company. Are they just doing it just fi sabilillah?
no, they would get more from the profits.
Yeah, they would earn profit. Could the profit be more than the 10,000 they'd earned had they lent you the money on interest? Could it be more? So they invested $100,000 in your company. Could they perhaps be making more than the 10,000 they'd get had they just given you the money in interest? Yes. Is there a problem with that? That they earn more by investing than they would if they just gave you a loan?
No,
Is there
there's
any
no
problem?
issue.
There's no issue with that. But the difference becomes manifest where? The difference becomes manifest. What if you lose money? If they're an investor, do you owe them anything if you lose money on your business?
Yes, but you borrowed.
No, because in an investment, did you borrow money from them? No, it's an investment, right? Let's say they invested $100,000. You invested $100,000. And they'll get 50% of the profits, 70% of the profits, whatever was agreed upon. Right? If you lose money in an investment, they're not owed anything. Right? They're not owed anything. And we'll look at sharika when it comes, right? But in a sharika, if they're an investor, they share in the profit and they share in the loss. Whereas if they lent you $100,000 to your Sibha company on interest, if you lost money, are you waived from paying the interest on the loan?
No.
No, you have to pay it. Right? So the one who just lends money is not sharing in any of the risk. They're gaining a return on their money without associated risk. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, أَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ, Allah has permitted trade and He has prohibited riba. But He does not deny, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not deny that is there a resemblance outwardly between the two? Yes, there is. In both cases, money is given and there's an expectation that the person who's giving the money will be safeguarding their capital and earning on it. But in one, they're earning just on the money they gave, whether you make money or not. In the case of investment, they are sharing in both the reward of your profits and the risk of your loss. Right? So this has a number of consequences. Amongst them, there is financial responsibility. Why? That let's say if you lend $100,000 to somebody, if you know you're going to get the money back because the law, the government backs you, etc., do you really care whether the money they borrowed was borrowed for a project that will be successful or not? Would they really care?
No, because they'll get the money either way.
No, you wouldn't care. Right? So what would it lead to? If you have a lot of money, you want to lend it out to people. Get into debt. Why? Because we are going to be able to secure the debt. Okay? Now, when people get into debt and they're worried about not being able to pay their debts, etc., they take out insurance. So the insurance companies make money by fueling the insecurity of those in debt. But the financing party, they are more secure, right? We're going to get our money back. So you're going to lend to everybody that you can. So you have a society that would be drowning in debt, but who benefits from that debt? The people who give the money. Right? So, and that's innately dhulm. Right? Innately dhulm. It may appear in the immediate to be financially advantageous. Oh, we got a car. We financed our fridge. We did this. We did that. Right? But who is benefiting from that? In the end, you pay. I was just looking at a piece of technology. A whim overtook me. I was just looking at it, so I just clicked to see. You can pay it in installments. Of course, you can't because it's riba, but it's a $500 thing. And say you can pay it over X number of payments. And if you pay it over 3 years, you'd end up paying $950 for the thing, almost double, just by paying in installments over X number of years. So people end up financially disadvantaging themselves, right, by the burden of debt that they have. And by fueling this kind of speculation, there is grave economic harm, not just on individuals, but on society as a whole. Right? And that's discussed in the related articles, so we'll look at that, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. But now let's look at the fiqh itself of it. So Imam Ibrahim al-Halabi rahimahullah ta'ala says, Babu riba, beginning with the definition. وفضل مال خال عن عوض شرط لأحد العاقدين في معاوضة مال بمال. Right? هو فضل مال, right? It is the residual, it is a specified increase that is unconnected with recognized exchange, right? عن عوض, then that's that's not connected to a recognized exchange. شرط لأحد العاقدين, specified to one of the two transacting parties. في معاوضة مال بمال, in an exchange of money for money, right? The stipulated monetary increase without consideration stipulated for one of the two transacting parties in a contract of exchange of an item of monetary value for another. So that is the definition of riba. So the very simple one is a loan. You give $100,000. So what does that represent? Right? Right? I give you $100,000 for $100,000. That's mu'awalati malin bimal. But there's a stipulated increase. What's the stipulated increase? That you will pay me $130,000 back in 30 months' time. So if you do that, right? You say, well, what about the time value of money? If you cannot earn money just by someone having that money for a period of time. You want to earn money? Invest. Right? If you want to earn money, invest. So you cannot make money just by lending money. Right? So we recognize that yes, there is a time value of money. That if that money you yourself were to invest it, do things with it, you would earn. But if you want to earn on your money by giving it to someone else, you cannot do that just by letting time pass on the money. But rather, you must invest. Right? So we recognize the time value of money, that of course, right, which is why one of the economic benefits of zakat, like how does zakat discourage hoarding? How would zakat discourage hoarding? Zakat would discourage hoarding because if you just keep your money sitting, what would happen? Each year, you would be losing 2.5% of your wealth, of your zakatable wealth. If you invest that extra money, do you pay zakat on it? No. You'd only pay zakat on your earnings. So that's where it prevents just the hoarding of wealth. So neither do you just lend out your money and make money on it, nor do you just keep your money hoarded up, because you have to pay 2.5% zakat on that money. So rather, you are called to invest responsibly. Right? Because why? Because you're supposed to be earning on an investment. So you would invest responsibly in entities that are likely to make you money so that you can gain on that investment. Okay. So this is the definition of riba. It has implications. وَعِلَّتُهُ الْقَدْرُ وَالْجِنْسِ. The legal cause of riba is the qadr, the extent, and the category of item. فحرم بيع الكيلي أو الوزن أو الوزن بجنسه متفاضلا أو نسيئة ولو غير مطموع كالجص والحديد. So therefore, it is impermissible to sell something sold by volume or something sold by weight for its own category, something else that is sold by weight or something else that is sold by volume, whether if both causes are found, right, then you cannot sell in disparity. You have to sell at par, the same extent, and you cannot sell with deferral, even in non-food items. وحل متماثلا مع التقابض. So if the same category is found and the same extent is found, then you could sell it at par. Right? You could sell it at par, and there has to be taqabud. There has to be a taking of ownership of it as well. Right? So riba applies not only to money, right, but it applies to exchange of items. Things would typically, classically be sold by weight or by volume. Right? So if you're exchanging, for example, rice for rice, and this would happen with wholesalers, for example. So you have the same category, rice, and if it's the same type of item, You have the same category and the same measure, right, sold by weight, for example, then it has to be sold at par, right? And it cannot be deferred. It cannot be deferred, right? So there cannot be disparity nor deferral. So if both the same category and the same extent are found, then it has two things apply. It has to be sold at par, with no disparity, and there has to be taqabud, a taking off, taking off ownership, right? Taking of possession. أو متفاضلا غير معير كحفنة بحفنة أو بيضة ببيضة أو تمرة بتمرة. But you can sell it not at par if it is something that does not enter under measure, under the legal unit. So you're selling, you're exchanging one egg for two. Right? Or one date for two. So that doesn't enter under regular Shari'i measures. It's just best to avoid that too. But because that's like almost like an informal exchange. So that would be allowed, right? Because there's no qadr, that this does not fall under standard units of measure. Okay? And that's typically like non-formal transaction. People would not trade in one date for two, right? فإن وجد الوصفان حرم الفضل والنساء. If both these qualities are found, namely the same category and the same extent, the same standard of measure, then you cannot sell at varying extents, and you cannot defer. Nasa is ta'jil, deferral. وَإِنْ عُدِمَا حَلَّا. But if you are exchanging different categories and different extents, then both selling at variance is permissible and deferral is permissible. وَإِنْ وُجِدَ أَحَدُهُمَا. If one of the two is found, فقط, only, حَلَّ التَّفَاضُل, then you can sell at variance, but you cannot defer it. So what is the consequence? So for example, if you're wholesalers, you want to exchange barley for wheat. Barley and wheat are different categories of items, correct?
Yes.
Correct? Yeah. But let's say both are sold by weight, barley and wheat. So in these kinds of exchanges, right, where only one of the two qualities is found, what can you do? So you have the standard of measure is the same, weight, but they're different categories. What can you do? You can sell with disparity. You can exchange a ton of wheat for 2 tons of barley. Any problems? No. But what can't you do in this situation?
Defer.
You cannot have deferral. Right? And the reason for that is so that you don't, one, it falls under the prophetic prohibition. There, number one. But number two, lest people use that as a means of de facto riba. Right? So if you're wholesaling, for example, you say, okay, look, I'll sell you, instead of exchanging in, sell me 2 tons of barley right now, I'll give you 1 ton of wheat a year later. So you're kind of factoring in riba into it. Right? So to avoid this in exchange transactions, this door was closed. Right? That you not make it an instrument for riba. And any situation where there is a shubha of riba. Right? So if you think about wholesalers, right? Someone wants to finance their, gain some liquidity, so they buy a crop for another and they just make it deferred. I'll pay you that a year later. In the meantime, they'll sell this, they'll earn, and the party who's providing the deferral, they'll make money on it. So, to close that door, deferral has been prohibited. Now, if you want to be able to do this, the safest way to deal with exchanges is to break it into 2 contracts. Right? So the ulama say that, like if you're a wholesaler or, you exchange items, even things that are sold by units. So to avoid falling into riba, what do? For example, like women fall into riba when it comes to jewelry, for example. So they give a lot of old jewelry and they buy new jewelry. But if you're exchanging gold for gold, what is required?
The same.
Parity is required. But are new pieces of jewelry the same value as old, worn out pieces of jewelry? No. So what do? Rather than make an exchange like that, you break it into 2 transactions. How much is this old jewelry worth? It's worth $20,000. Okay, I sell you this jewelry for $20,000 in exchange, and I will buy this $20,000 worth of jewelry. So you make 2 contracts. Sell your jewelry for X amount and then buy X amount of the other jewelry. So it's 2 separate contracts, and then one payment covers the other. That's fine. So that's by breaking down 2 contracts, you avoid these situations in contracts of exchange. If you're a wholesaler, you have good quality basmati rice and cheap, chunky rice. Would you exchange 100 kilos of premium basmati rice for cheap rice at par? Would you?
No.
No. So what do? Right? You cannot, but can you sell, well, this quality of this rice is better quality than that rice? That, when the same category is found, and we'll see, no consideration is given to quality. No consideration is given to quality. So therefore, the only solution you have is you break into 2 contracts. Sell the basmati rice for X amount, right? Let's say $1,000, $1,000, and you buy $1,000 worth of the other rice, 2 contracts, and that way the issue of riba does not come, because if the same category, same extent, and same category is found, you cannot defer and you cannot sell at variance. And this closes the doors to engagement in riba. So that people, instead of lending money, they just make exchanges of any items as a financing of riba. Okay. فلا يصح سلم هروي في هروي ولا بر في شعير. Right? So therefore you cannot have a salam transaction, and we'll be coming to salam transactions, right? Salam transactions, which is, in general, are you allowed to sell something in the future?
Not as a base.
No. Can I sell you? I sell you this sibha for $100, and I'll give owner, and it becomes yours 3 months from now. You can't do that by default. The only exception to selling something into the future is textually is salam. Is salam, right? Which is a future sale with very strict conditions, where payment is made up front and the item of sale is deliverable at a specified time in the future. But there's very strict conditions that's permitted by the Quran as an exception and permitted in the Sunnah. And there's also manufacturing contracts which are similar to salam, and those are allowed. So here he tells us that you cannot make a salam a future sale of harawi, which is a type of cloth. Harawi cloth from Herat, which is in Afghanistan, modern day Afghanistan. You see, you cannot have a deferred sale of harawi cloth for harawi cloth. Right? Because if the same category is found, both are cloth, can you have a deferred sale? So I sell you this, 100 meters of harawi cloth now for 100 meters of harawi cloth deliverable in a month's time?
No.
No, because if you have the same category and the same extent and the same category, same item, it has to be at par and you cannot defer it. You cannot defer it. And as we'll see, quality does not enter into it either. Right? So this closes the doors to any kind of riba. Right? You say, okay, I'll sell you. Someone doesn't have money. So you say, look, give me cheap harawi cloth now, and in 6 months' time, give me higher quality harawi cloth. So why would they do this? Right? So that one is worth 30% more in the market. Right? So this would be used as an instrument of riba. I can't give you $100,000 for $130,000 in the future. So what trick would people use? I'll give you, let's say a certain type of cloth that is worth $100,000 now for the same amount, whatever, how much did we say? 100 meters of the same cloth, of cloth, but of a higher grade, due 6 months from now. So essentially what happens, it's like a riba vehicle, right? And people want riba because people like the tangible. People, and they naturally associate time value. If you want to earn, invest, basically. So it closes the door to riba. Now you can break into contracts. Allah has permitted trade. So this is here, right? What is shared between the two types of cloth, the same category. ولا بر في شعير, right? أي ولا يصح سلم بر في شعير. And you cannot have a future sale, a deferred sale, a salam sale of bur, of wheat, for barley. Why? Because they're both sold using the same measure. So if you have the same measure, you cannot have a deferred sale. Again, the wisdom being to close the door for riba. وشرط التعيين والتقابض في الصرف. In sarf transactions, in currency exchange transactions, there has to be specification and taking of possession in the same majlis for those, right? So if you exchange gold for gold, right? Gold for gold has to be, exchanged at par and in the same majlis. You want to exchange gold for silver, you cannot defer it. Why? Again, to close the doors for riba or anything resembling riba. And there's clear prohibitions from the Prophet ﷺ against sarf, transactions of exchange of gold and silver, except with taking possession in the majlis. Basically, to close the doors for riba. Okay, so why? Because otherwise people, what could you do? You could exchange gold now for silver payable in 6 months. Why would you do that? As a loophole to riba, right? So you'd negotiate favorable terms. So let's say $100,000 worth of gold now for silver that is worth $150,000 payable in 2 years. Essentially, what are you doing? You're exchanging, giving $100,000 now for $150,000 due later. You can't do that. So that's why sarf transactions, exchange of gold and silver, is only permitted with taking possession in the majlis. You cannot defer it. And sometimes people say, why is that such a big deal? Now, the Auntie Zubaydah, if she's taking her gold to the gold seller, says, okay, I will give you this jewelry now in exchange for these gold pieces, this gold jewelry that you can give me in a week's time. You can't do that. Why? Because the door, now she's not engaging in a ribawi transaction. But if you want to close the doors for riba, you got to close them properly. Right? Just like traffic laws. They don't just apply. Can you skip the red light if there's no one around? No. Right? Zubair is late for his appointment with Zubaydah. Can he jump the red light? Even though he can see in all directions, there are no cars. Are you allowed to break the law?
No.
Yeah. Even though there's a wisdom for the law and does not relate to getting, to this situation, there's no danger, but the law has to be set objectively. And very often he might think there's no traffic, but he only looked at 3 sides. He didn't look at, to the left, and he gets run over, or he hits the other traffic, right? So these are limits. The wisdom in it is to avoid riba, basically. Right? Now, do the rulings of sarf, right, of what in our slides we defined as currency exchange, do they apply to the exchange of currencies or the buying and selling of gold online, you can see related answers on Seeker's Guidance. And there's some good answers from Sheikh Muhammad Carr based on the Hanafi school on this. And contemporary Hanafis say no. You can buy and sell gold online, even deferred. And if people want details, there's extensive discussion on this in Mufti Taqi Usmani's Fiqh al-Buyur. Sidi Abdul Latif, if we could remind me, we'll share the associated section on that. And that facilitates buying and selling of gold online. Just do not do so speculatively. Right? And the details of sarf are coming in an upcoming chapter. Right? Here the point is that you can, if the same category is found, you cannot defer. Okay. Then when it came to the prohibition to certain things being, things were classically sold either by weight or by volume. In our times, you have, things sold by weight, like by kilos, for example, in most of the world, or sold by volume, liters. So in the hadiths on riba, and this is the second thing we'll share, the hadith, the key hadith here on riba, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned certain things that they're prohibited by weight, and certain things were mentioned as being prohibited by volume. So classically they said that which the Prophet ﷺ forbade exchanging by weight, it is always considered by weight. So even if people trade it in volume, right? Because certain things you could, there's a let's say honey. You could sell it by weight, you could sell it by volume, right? Similarly, wheat, barley, rice, certain things, you could sell it by weight or you could sell it by volume, because things have weight and they have volume. So the classical position is that which the Prophet ﷺ mentioned in the hadith as being by weight is always, riba in it is considered by weight. So you have to make sure that it is at par by weight. And that which the Prophet ﷺ specified as being by volume, you always have to make sure it is at par by volume, even if people deal with it by weight instead. So that's what he tells us. Right? وَمَا نُصَّ عَلَى تَحْرِيمِ الرِّبَى فِيهِ كَيْلًا فَهُوَ كَيْلِيٌّ أَبَدًا كَالْبُرِّ وَالشَّعِيرِ وَالتَّمْرِ وَالْمِلْحِ. So that which the hadith, نص النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم في حديثه, that which the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم specified in his noble hadith as being prohibited, as riba being prohibited in it, by volume, it is always considered by volume when it comes to riba. Namely, wheat, barley, dates, and salt. وَمَا نُصَّ عَلَى تَحْرِيمِهِ وَزْنًا فَهُوَ وَزْنِيٌّ أَبَدًا. And that which the hadith mentions as being prohibited by weight, then it always has to be at par in a transaction by weight. كَالذَّهَبِ وَالْفِضَّةِ, such as gold and silver. And these are the 6 items that were mentioned in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and we'll share the hadith and its explanation. So this is the transmitted position of the Hanafi school. And this is how people historically traded in these items. People historically traded in these items in this particular manner. Okay. And that's what Imam Ibrahim al-Halabi mentions in his matn. Right? And he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَلَوْ تُعُورِفَ بِخِلَافِهِ. Even if people happened to make the urf, ولو تعورف بخلافه أي ولو أي ويكون يعني كيلي ووزني أبدا ولو تعورف بخلافه, and it will be considered as such even if people establish the norm of trading in it otherwise, right? Regardless of custom. Right? Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ specified the text as being as such. 4 items were mentioned in the hadith as being considered by volume. 2 were mentioned as being considered by weight. So it's our duty there to defer our customs to the text. And that's a legally stronger position. And the legally safer position. Why? Because the basis of riba is, the basis of matters related to riba is caution. And this is what the Hanafis upheld, right? But there are certain areas that are based on caution, such as matters related to rights, such as matters related to ownership, such as matters related in transactions to riba. But then there was a big problem that the fuqaha had to deal with, that people's customs veered further and further away from this reality, number one. And number 2, people's ignorance that they wouldn't have the caution that regardless of what people's custom is, if you're a person of deen, these things, trade with them by volume rather than weight. So they had to deal with it. So there, you can see the discussion in both commentaries. They found a narration from Imam Abu Yusuf. Right? It's a riwayah. Anhu. If it says indahu, it means this is his opinion. Anhu, meaning this is a narration from him, that you consider the urf of people even in these 4 matters, because the Prophet ﷺ, what he's emphasizing is that these things have to be sold at par. And so that's the absolute requirement in that hadith. It is simply a description of the urf at the time of the Prophet ﷺ that he mentions 4 of the matters as being by volume and 2 of the matters being by weight. So this text by Abu Yusuf said, okay, the text, what is the text absolutely emphasizing? That if you're exchanging like for like, it has to be at par. That is the absolute requirement, decisively established. As for it being by volume in the 4 matters mentioned, and it being by weight in the 2 matters mentioned, that is descriptive of the prophetic custom, the custom in the prophetic community. So therefore, on this, the consideration was that we follow the urf in these matters. So it has to be at par in whichever measure they use, weight or volume. And Imam al-Haskafi relates from a number of texts, amongst them Al-Burhan, Sharh Mawahib al-Rahman of al-Tarabusi, Ibn al-Humam, Al-Kamal Ibn al-Humam in Fath al-Qadir, and Imam al-Tumurtashi al-Ghazi in Al-Minah, Sharh Tanwir al-Absar, that the fatwa is on this. And he quotes the Kafi of Imam al-Nasafi, also agreeing on this, that we consider the custom of people in their transaction with respect to measure across the board. So that's the fatwa position. So you make a note of that over here. وَلَوْ تُعُرِفَ بِخِلَافِهِ, right? But the fatwa is not on this. The fatwa is not on this, as explained in the 2 commentaries. Okay. And وَمَا لَا نَصَّ فِيهِ حُمِلَ عَلى الْعُرْفِ. And anything that's not of those 6 items mentioned in the hadith, in that hadith, we consider it's it being at par according to the urf, right? كغير الستة المذكورة, like other than these 6 that have been mentioned. Okay. فلا يجوز بيع البر بالبر متماثلا وزنا. So it's not permitted to sell wheat for wheat at par by weight. Why? Because these were, what were they specified as in the hadith?
By volume.
By volume. So this is the ظاهر الرواية position, but ولا الذهب بالذهب متماثلا كيلا, nor can you exchange gold for gold at par by volume. Why? Because the text mentions gold being exchanged how?
Wasn't.
By weight. It's wazni. So it's an application of those rulings. But urf applies to all of these. They have to be at par according to what the urf is of trading in these. وَجَازَ بَيْعُ فَلْسٍ بِفَلْسَيْن مُعَيَّنَيْن. It is permitted to trade one specific fels for 2 specific fels. The fulus are base currency. Base currency, like loose change. Right? And before, they say, they say that the wisdom of calling the bankrupt person bankrupt, muflis, is that the muflis is the one who has nothing in his pocket except for fulus, right? Except for loose change. If you go to let's say in our times, if you go to the supermarket and you have a pocket full of loose change, small change, could you buy much with it?
No.
No, right? So there, if you exchange, but even the example they give is 1 fels for 2 fels. And the situation could be someone needs candy, so they say, okay, but the candy machine only takes a quarter. You have $1 thing, so give me 2 quarters, I'll take the $1, right? Like that. Is that a financing arrangement? Right, so stingy Uncle Latif only has, like if you're in Canada, we have these things, we used to have these things called loonies, like $1 coins. And they call loonies because they have a loon on them. So he's stingy, but this kid really wants 3 quarters for this machine. So, you exchange it for a loonie, okay. But that's not a financing thing. That's fine. So that's allowed, right? Because it's not really got a shubha of riba. It would come up in little transactions. Someone wants loose change, whatever. So they allowed it. But Imam Muhammad did not. Khilafan li Muhammad. Imam Muhammad did not. Why? Because this too is a standard. It is a standard. So it has to be, if you exchange fulus for fulus, it has to be at par. And Al-Kamal ibn al-Humam took the position of Imam Muhammad al-Hasan, not just for the legal strength of his argument and the caution of applying riba even in fulus, but in those later centuries, a reality occurred, which was that you have many people, you had a spreading of base currencies. Currency from that is not gold and silver. So the rule, so riba applies to those as well. Some people say, well, the Hanafis allow riba in fulus. And they say, well, modern currency is fulus, right? Is fulus in that it's base currency. It's not gold and silver. The answer would be that no, that argument does not apply, because if you were to consider modern currency to be like fulus, the fatwa is that riba applies to fulus as well. Though most of the Arab scholars consider, modern currencies to be a new category of thaman that's akin to gold and silver. And that's coming up a little bit later when we look at sarf, right? But riba applies to modern currency, full stop. The prevalent analysis is that modern currency is finished. Modern currency is like gold and silver. It is a thaman istilahan. It's also a thaman. And that's coming in the section on sarf, so we'll look at it there. But fulus, according to Imam Muhammad al-Hasan, riba applies to, and the fatwa is on the position of Imam Muhammad ibn al-Hasan. Right? So make note of that. And some of the Hanafi scholars, and this is a position taken by many of the Hanafis of the Indian subcontinent, is that modern currency is like fulus ra'ija, is like base currencies, but riba does apply to it. And we'll look at that further in the next, when we come to the section on sarf. ويجوز بيع الكرباس بالقطن. It is permitted to sell cotton cloth for cotton. Why? Because the basic principle is that categories are considered by the usage of something, right? So even though they're both from cotton, is the use of cloth the same as of loose cotton? No. So the fuqaha don't look at the realities of things. A category changes by the change of its primary use. So the use of cloth is, what do you do with cloth? You wear it. You use cloth for whatever cloth is used for. But as for cotton, you use it to make, thread with it, but cotton is used for many other things as well. It's used for stuffing, it's used for, bunch of other things. So according to the fuqaha, the logicians look at categories by the essence and reality of something. Right? So the jins, according to according to the ulama of logic, is by the reality of something. But the fuqaha are not interested in the reality of something. They're looking at the action associated with the thing, which is in this case, by the usage of something. So if things are used differently, they are different categories. Right? So, وَبَيْعُ اللَّحْمِ بِالْحَيَوَانِ. It is permitted to sell meat for an animal. Because the animal you can do different things with. But the meat is for eating. Right? You don't eat the animal themselves. So you could exchange these even at a variance. وعند محمد لا يجوز بيع الحيوان بيعه بحيوان جنسه حتى يكون اللحم أكثر مما في الحيوان من لحم. Imam Muhammad applied caution. So this position is not really out. You couldn't really act on it, that you cannot exchange an animal for meat unless the amount of meat in the animal unless the meat that you take is more than the meat in the animal, right? So it's like you're exchanging the meat for the meat and the extra meat for the remaining things in the animal, the skin and the bones and all that, right? But the fatwa position is the position of Imam Abu Hanifa in this. ويجوز بيع الدقيق بالدقيق متماثلا كيلا. It is permitted to sell daqiq, flour for flour, at par by volume. What's the concern about flour? What would the concern about flour be? Flour is loose, right? So what would happen if you're selling by volume? One could be packed in tight, the other could be very loose. So they said that does not vary very much, right? You say, okay, just put it in normally, don't pack it in, so there's no gross variance in that. You can tell that they're at par. So you can establish parity, and that is an ignored concern. Right? It's not an ignored concern. Right? So that's the concern. لا بالسويق أصلا خلافا لهما. But you cannot exchange wheat for you cannot exchange flour for oiled flour. Sawiq is a flour that has been cooked with oil. Cooked with oil or mixed with oil. Why? They put oil in flour in order to preserve it. That's sawiq. Cooked or uncooked. There are different ways that put it together, and that would preserve it. It would take the moisture out. Because there, you're exchanging wheat for wheat, and there is the oil that's there, so you cannot ensure parity. So how do you solve this? You break it into two separate transactions. خلافا لهما. But the Sahibain allowed it because they consider the amount of oil there could be ignored. And then in the same sense, ويجوز بيع الرطب بالرطب متماثلا. It is permitted to sell raw dates for raw dates at par. وكذا بيع الرطب بالتمر والعنب بالزبيب متماثلا خلافا لهما. And according to Imam Abu Hanifa, you could sell raw dates for dried dates, or عنب or grapes for raisins متماثلا, at par. Because they're both, what are they used for? They're both used for eating. And as long as they are at par, you can exchange them. And the concern about difference in size and so on does not lead to dispute and is not a vehicle for riba. So Imam Abu Hanifa allowed it. وكذا بيع البر رطبا أو مبلولا بمثله. And likewise, it is permitted to sell wheat, whether moist, whether dry, whether moist or wet, for the like of it. أو باليابس, or for dry wheat. Right? Because sometimes if there's rain, etc., you could have moist or even wet wheat. So you can exchange it for dry wheat. Although caution would be to break it into two transactions. والتمر أو الزبيب منقعين بمثلهما. Right? And it is permitted to sell dates or raisins that are moistened, munqa'in, for the like of them. Mutasawiyan, as long as they're level, if they are at par. Khilafan li Muhammad. Munqa'in would be if you took the raisins, right? Because when raisins are dried, they shrivel. The munqa'in would be, they would be moistened. So they freshen up. And as long as they are at par, it is permitted to sell them. So these are examples. Right? And he says, وَيَجُوزُ بَيْعُ لَحْمِ حَيَوَانٍ بِلَحْمِ حَيَوَانٍ غَيْرِ جِنْسِهِ مُتَفَاضِلًا. It is permitted to sell the meat of one category of animal for another category of animal for different amounts. So you could sell 20 kilos of beef for 30 kilos of chicken. Two different categories. Right? But because they're both sold by weight, what do you have to have in this case, Sadati? What would you have to have if you're exchanging? Let's say 20 kilos of beef for 30 kilos of sheep meat, for example, mutton. Yeah, you would have to have no deferral, right? Because they're different categories, but they share the same extent, so you cannot do deferral. And the wisdom being so that we don't build in loopholes for riba. What's the way of safety? Butchers want to exchange meat. One butcher is running out of beef today. It's okay. Tomorrow I'll give you some of that veal that you really wanted. How do you solve this problem, Sadati?
Separate the two contracts.
Yeah, just break it into two contracts. Do you have to actually make a payment? No. Like what you do, so okay, well, one butcher is running out of beef today. Okay, can you give me 100 kilos of that beef? Sure. But say, okay, and in exchange for 50 kilos of the goat meat you wanted for tomorrow. No. Just break into two contracts, set a price, and one price would cancel out the other. And that's what you teach traders, that in if you're exchanging items, break it into two contracts and you avoid the challenges, you avoid falling into riba. In many cases it's innocent, but this is to close the loophole for riba. Okay, Bismillah. And likewise, وَكَذَا اللَّبَنْ. Likewise, milk. So please finish right now. وَالْجَامُوس مَعَ الْبَقَرِ جِنْسٌ وَاحِدٌ. So buffalo with cows are considered the same category. وَكَذَا الْمَعِزْ مَعَ الضَّأْنِ. And likewise, sheep with goats. وَالْبُخْتُ مَعَ الْعِرَابِ. Right? And likewise, the bukht camels and the irab camels are considered one category. Right? And what's considered for, in classical things is that which the Arabs considered to be one category or not. Right? And then he says, وَيَجُوزُ بَيْعُ خَلِّ الْعِنَبِ بِخَلِّ الدَّقَلِ مُتَفَاضِلًا. It is permitted to sell to exchange grape vinegar for date vinegar at variance because they're two different categories. وكذا شحم البطن بالألية أو باللحم. And likewise, you can exchange stomach fat for rump fat or for meat because they have different usages. والخبز بالبر, and you can exchange bread for wheat or for أو الدقيق or for flour. أو السويق or for oiled flour. وإن كان أحدهما نسيئة به يفتى, even if one is deferred, and that's a fatwa position. But the way to facilitate all of these for traders is just tell them, if you're exchanging items for items, just incorporate a price into it, so break it into two transactions, and you avoid all the scenarios of riba. Yeah, that's just a good habit to get into. And he says, ولا يجوز بيع الجيد بالرديء مما فيه الربا إلا متساويا. It is not permitted to sell good quality of an item for a lower quality of an item in the matters where there's riba, i.e., they're of the same category, except at par. And right, وكذا البسر بالتمر, right? And likewise, fresh dates for dried dates. And the governing principle is that إذا اتحد الجنس, right, if the category is the same, فلا عبرة بالوصف, right? If you are exchanging the same category, then there is no consideration for the quality. There's no consideration for quality. Why? Lest we fall into the situation of riba. And we explained that earlier. So if you wanted to do it this way, break it into two valid contracts instead. So if you want to exchange rice, good quality rice for cheaper rice, it has to be at par. So the only solution is break it into two contracts. And he says, rahimahullah ta'ala, ولا, sorry, we missed an issue at the end. ولا بيع البر بالدقيق أو بالسويق أو بالنخالة مطلقا. It is not permitted to sell wheat for flour or for the oiled flour or for the wheat, the nukhala, the wheat bran. Absolutely. Why? Because there's too much variance in these, so it would be riba. And you can read the discussions on why in the commentary. It's of less. Now, ولا بيع الزيتون بالزيت. Can you exchange oil, olives for oil? والسمسم بالشيرج, or sesame for sesame oil. شيرج is sesame oil. حتى يكون الزيت والشيرج أكثر مما في الزيتون. Unless the oil itself, right, the olive oil or the sesame oil is more than the amount of oil that's in the olives or the sesame. لتكون الزيادة بالثجير, so that the extra amount of the oil cover, as it were, the thajir, which is the remaining part of the olive or the sesame. Now that would appear disadvantageous, right? Because the essence of the value of the olives is the oil. The essence of the value of the sesame is its oil. But this is to avoid riba. So if you want to exchange these, the way of safety is break it into two contracts. Break it into two contracts. Right? ولا يستقرض الخبز أصلا. And you cannot lend bread at all. Right? You cannot lend bread at all. Lend bread, of course, meaning make it a contract. I'll give you 10 pieces of bread today for 12 pieces of bread, for 10 pieces of bread tomorrow. Right? Why? So Imam Abu Hanifa's argument was that in his time, people would bake bread in bakeries. You'd have small pieces of bread, large pieces of bread. Bread comes in different sizes. So he said that there would be a shubha of riba there, right? Because there would be tafawut fahish, excessive difference. So meaning of riba comes in, and would open the door because bread. If people start just exchanging bread, okay, I'll give you 10 pieces of bread today for 10 pieces of bread tomorrow, but then there'd be an unstated expectation of you give me better bread tomorrow, etc. So, it would either lead to dispute or lead to injustice. That was Abu Hanifa's concern. But the Sahibain allowed this because in their times, basically what happened, bread sizes standardized in the market, right? So they said, وَعِنْدَ أَبِي يُوسُف يَجُوزْ وَزْنًا وَبِهِ يُفْتَى. And according to Abu Yusuf, you could lend bread by weight. And the fatwa is on that. Right? And Imam Muhammad allowed it by weight or by number as well. وعند محمد يجوز عددا أيضا. And Muhammad allowed lending bread by number as well. Okay. But lending meaning that, okay, you take 10 pieces of bread today and give me back 10 pieces of bread tomorrow. And especially if you consider one restaurant ran out of bread. So they're not just giving you the bread. It's okay, we'll give you, 200 pita breads today. Give us 200 pita breads tomorrow. One shawarma place ran out of bread. So they allowed it because the sizes were standardized. It is not something used for dispute. And they found people do not engage in loopholes of riba with bread. Right? If people do in some place, then the fatwa would go and change. And then there's this issue of riba and dar al-harb. We will continue from there, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, and then start the next chapter. It's a very important issue, and we'll cover it in a certain amount of detail. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. So we'll take the issue of riba and dar al-harb and then look at حقوق and istihqaq. Any questions before we close? Sadati? Okay. So there's a number of issues we mentioned that where the fatwa is not on the position of Imam Abu Hanifa. Why? Because fiqh is based on underlying, there are texts, and then there's also in the application of text, there are underlying considerations. So Imam Abu Hanifa's underlying considerations, which you've explained, on some issues differed from the underlying considerations of the Sahibain. Sometimes it is due to change in custom. And then we saw in some that when the custom of people drifted very far away from the prophetic text, they looked deeply at the prophetic text, that you could break down what the Prophet ﷺ specified as to the absolute requirement, which is that exchanges be at par, and that the Prophet ﷺ specifying weight and volume was a description of the prevalent market practice in his time. So this like other chapters where there's nuance, requires some effort on your part to review your notes, clarify, understand, ask, etc. بإذن الله. وبارك الله تعالى فيكم. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.